So to start, I wonder if I can turn to you, Professor Cohen, and ask you to tell us a little bit about the message of the book. What's the main argument that you're making here?
So thanks for so many of you coming out. You know I am not Michael Cohen, right? I was trying to explain to myself the turnout, and I thought, oh, they think it's Michael Cohen testifying. So very briefly, excuse me, here are the points that define the book. And it's a book not for my colleagues, such as Daniel, who has his own important and scholarly work and whose perspectives differ from mine on many subjects. But this is a book that grew out of radio broadcasts, actually, and is for more general readers. And I make these arguments. There's a new Russian-American Cold War. This was denied. I started making this argument almost more than 15 years ago. It was coming, and people said it wasn't possible. Now there's an agreement, I think, generally, by whatever words, there's a new Cold War. More controversial, and a main theme of the book, is that the new Cold War is more dangerous than the one we survived. Now, I say we, mindful that there's several generations in this room, and Katrina and I met with a group of students beforehand tonight, and they seem to be somewhere between 15 and 18 years old, and this is a generation that did not experience Cold War, and as I said to them, now you get your chance. And I hope you can do better with what confronts you now than maybe my generation or Daniel, who's a generation younger, have done. The third theme of the book is what I call Intelgate, from intelligence services. I look at Russiagate and I see in there a role, a shadowy role, played by the intelligence services, going back to maybe as early as 2015, certainly 2016. I'm not much interested in conspiracy theories. But what the intelligence services have done, in a way they didn't do toward the end of the previous Cold War, is wildly hype what they call the Russian threat. I don't see any gigantic Russian threat other than ones we ourselves have created. So I'm alarmed by the way the intelligence services are feeding a testimony to Congress and in the media that Russia, and they add China, is a grave threat to America. Fourthly, for people who take a dissenting view, there is, alas, a kind of neo-McCarthyism underway. Calling people Putin puppets or Kremlin apologists because we don't agree with the official narrative of the new Cold War stifles debate. But Katrina, who herself what began as a student of McCarthyism, a scholar of McCarthyism, and edits a magazine that had its war not only with McCarthy, but with this kind of behavior, maybe speaks best on that. Fifth, I see our essential mainstream media not doing a good job in covering Russia today, or Russiagate for that matter. They omit a lot, they select a lot of things that don't make a lot of sense, except in terms of their own narrative, but what they exclude is really shocking compared to what they included, let's say, in the 70s and 80s when I entered the field. And finally, and this strikes me autobiographically is really alarming, and I make a good deal of this in the book, that when I entered as a professor, public life, such as it was, in the 1970s and 80s, there was a formidable anti-Cold War opposition in the United States, from an aide or two to the president, to certain people in the State Department, to large segments of the mass media, to the heads of major American corporations, PepsiCo, Control Data, IBM, Occidental Petroleum, that wanted to do business in the Soviet Union and wanted to constrain the Cold War so that there was political space for their business. Today, about 160 sizable American corporations are doing good, profitable business in Russia, and their CEOs are silent about the new Cold War. So we have no opposition in the media, none in political life, none in the political parties, none at the grassroots. There is no political opposition to the new Cold War, and that's one reason why I think it's more dangerous. And I hope, well, anyway, that's one of the several reasons I give in the book why this Cold War is more dangerous. I'll end on that point.
Okay, thank you. It's a very rich book, and there are very many themes that I can't wait to get into discussing in more detail. But first, Katrina, I have to ask about this this point that Alexander already raised in the preface of the book, where Steve thanks you and maybe even slightly apologetically points out that you don't fully agree with every aspect. So can you tell us a little bit about, if you don't want to say what you don't agree with, about what you do agree with in the book?
Thank you, Daniel, for being so diplomatic. First of all, I want to thank the World Affairs Council, because I do think what we have lacked in these last few years, these charged years, is debate, is reasoned discussion, is civil discourse. And we've heard too much vilification instead of fostering debate, and the nation is devoted to fostering, not policing debate, to laying out alternatives, not vilifying people. Steve and I have been going to Moscow together for some 30 years, and I think of that because I agree with Steve that our media has failed us in many ways, our mainstream media, our cable media. History matters. Context matters. And I think of that particularly because in a week, Mikhail Gorbachev, who I think is one of the great visionary leaders, turns 88. And can you imagine, as he looks out at the world, having thought he ended the Cold War along with George H.W. Bush, that the arms race had subsided, the INF Treaty abolishing an entire class of weapons. I think it's important to remember, and here I agree with Steve, that de-democratization did not begin under Putin. It began under Yeltsin. Gorbachev opened the door to democracy. Putin's first act in power was to give Yeltsin and his family immunity, and I think that's worth remembering. What I agree with Steve about, and we talked with the great students, is that this Cold War is more dangerous than the previous one, that exchanges are being dismantled, points of deconfliction, so to speak, points of exchanges that played a role are being dismantled. And we're at a point, what's interesting about Steve's columns is that the book began before Trump. But once Trump entered the picture, the demonization of Putin, and I am much more of a critic, I think, of Putin than Steve is. We disagree and differ in that way. But suddenly Trump became Putin and Putin became Trump, and there was this mass demonization. Two things I'll say. Having lived through a previous Cold War, I've seen that Cold Wars empower war parties on both sides. They increase already bloated defense budgets that are needed, funds desperately needed to rebuild our own country. Nationalist fervor increases. The space for dissent, for activism. And I've worked with feminist groups in Russia, I've worked with independent journalists, with NGOs, and I've seen what the previous Cold War did and what's happening now to narrow space here and in that country for those kinds of alternative views. I think it's very dangerous. So the one area where I disagree with Steve is I think it's dangerous that we're reflexively anti-Trump. I think it's important when Trump says in his toxic way, let's find a way out of Afghanistan or Syria, or open diplomacy with North Korea, or have better relations with Russia. I think that's important to seize upon, but not see in Trump our savior. Not our savior, but Trump. I think Steve sees in Trump, relies on Trump too much, when I think we need to build around Trump a Congress that will reassert itself on matters in war and peace. We need to rebuild the social movements. I told the students that in 1982, there were 1 million people in Central Park to support the INF Treaty. We need to rebuild those possibilities. So in that sense, it's been an exciting few years living with the most controversial Russia expert in America. and our dinner table conversations are vigorous. Our daughter has taken a sabbatical in California. But otherwise, the nation stays strong, and I'm proud that the nation represents and publishes, and there are a few good nation readers and people who've gone on nation cruises here. We represent a range of views. Many liberal progressive publications, I think to their discredit, have only one line. And I think we need a range of views on all subjects to have a debate.
Thank you. Okay, Steve, I have to push you a little on this point of the new Cold War, because on the one hand, if I heard right, you said Russia is not a great threat to the US. On the other hand, you argue that we're in a new Cold War, that I think you've said that the current situation is even more dangerous than the Cuban Missiles Crisis. So can you spell out what you're most alarmed by? If we're on the verge of a shooting war with Russia, how would that come about? What's the scenario that you're most afraid of? How could this, what exactly is the source of the danger?
Well, I see a lot of sources of danger in the behavior of both sides, but if you're talking about how we might go from Cold War to hot war, the two places where the potential have already shown themselves are Syria and Ukraine. So let's take what happened on November 25th under the new Kerch Bridge in the Sea of Azov off the Black Sea, and it was, well, leave aside the fact that it was a provocation. What happened was there was a shootout between Russian gunboats and Ukrainian gunboats, and the Russians took the Ukrainian gunboats and soldiers prisoner, and I think they may still be holding them now. In Washington and in Brussels, in NATO headquarters, there were calls to send NATO warships into this area of the Kerch Bridge. That would have meant war with Russia, for sure. Now, why? So the Kerch Bridge, as some of you know, is this quite remarkably quickly done engineering feat that Russia achieved by building now an automotive, but soon to be a train bridge too, from the Russian mainland to Crimea. So the Russians regard this not only as a triumph of effort and money, but as a great strategic asset. And anybody who comes through near that bridge with ill intent is going to get whacked. American battleships or NATO battleships, and there are people calling for this. I mean, United States senators calling for this. Let's flip to Syria. You've got, and I personally think Trump is doing the right thing in trying to remove those 2,000 Americans in Syria, because they serve, so far as I can tell, unless they're meant to be a beachhead to a war against Iran, no function whatsoever in Syria. But what if several of those Americans, because there are a lot of Russian fighters there too, in the air and the land, what if some of those Americans are killed by Russian troops accidentally? What next? So you have a kind of frenzy in the Congress already. The media not balanced, let's say, about Russia, and Trump in the White House. A Trump who already sent missiles into Syria to prove that he wasn't soft on Putin or something once. I mean, what would happen if Americans died at Russian hands in Syria? And there are too many Americans on the ground in Ukraine, too. We don't know how many, but my count, at least 1,500 American so-called trainers in Ukraine. What if they're killed by Russians? So these are the kind of tripwires. Oh, and not to forget the NATO buildup in the Baltics. I was told the other day, I'm not sure it's true, but that conventional, not missile, NATO artillery can strike St. Petersburg from where they're positioned. This is not good. I mean, the potential for inadvertent war is too great. So I'd see at least 3 sites where this could happen, if worse came to worse.
Thank you. You brought up Ukraine, and let me come back to that in the context of the question how we get out of this. So given Crimea, eastern Ukraine, how do we deal with this? Now, if you're a realist like Henry Kissinger, I suppose you can say, so what? Putin broke international law. We do that too. International politics is a matter of power. We should just forget about what's happened in Ukraine and move on. But although we too have done some bad stuff around the world, intervening in places in ways that are costly and counterproductive, the US has not in recent decades invaded and annexed territory of a neighbor. That is something that, although it's not unique, is quite rare and dangerous to the post-1945 international order. So what do we do? Now, there's the Minsk Accords, but they're not going anywhere. So if Putin is not willing to stop supporting the rebels in the Donbass, if he's not willing to reopen the question of Crimea, and it's pretty clear he's not, then how do we get past this? We accept that Russia has the right to invade and destabilize its neighbors. We agree to the sphere of influence in Eastern Europe that Putin wants. Is that really what you're arguing?
Well, I see the history of this somewhat differently. And we all know that where you come from is where you are and probably where you're headed. First of all, it's not true that the United States never invaded a country and annexed it in recent history. We essentially annexed Kosovo. We bombed Serbia into submission. We attached Kosovo to NATO or the United Nations, and now we've declared Kosovo an independent state. And the Russians cite that now as a precedent. Now, we all know, our mothers told us, two wrongs don't make a right, and it's particularly dangerous in international affairs. But it's not quite right to say that we didn't create a precedent, though I would agree with you, Russia didn't need a precedent to do what they did. The question becomes, and it's a long story, but make it short, I see no evidence that Putin as leader had any interest in Crimea whatsoever until 2014. There was one political party in Russia, as Daniel knows, that was interested in Crimea, a failed party formed by Primakov and Lushkov for whichever election it was. And one of their campaigns was bring Crimea home or something like that. It got zero traction. I mean, they couldn't get 4% of the vote. There was no interest in the Russian political elite or in Russian society of any significance of reclaiming Crimea, though you could make a reasonable case that Crimea historically was Russian, and it was a fluke that territorially it was now on Ukraine's map. So what provoked it? What provoked it was the Ukrainian crisis. So you will have to decide who provoked the Ukrainian crisis. And I'll ask you one question to remind you what happened. 2013, the European Union offered or told the duly elected, constitutionally elected, nobody doubted that, however corrupt he was, president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, that he had a choice. He could continue his trade relationship with Russia, or he could join the so-called European Union Economic Partnership and trade with Europe. And that was the choice he faced. And it was no choice. 40%, approximately, of Ukrainian trade was with Russia. Ukraine had nothing except immigrants who would be competitive in the European market. Economists explained to him it was going to cost him $80 billion by the time his re-election campaign was going to begin. So why? He was cornered. What did he do? He didn't refuse to sign the European agreement. He asked for more time. And that triggered the rebellion that led to Maidan, that led to Yanukovych fleeing, that led to what Russia perceived to be a threat to Crimea. Was there a real threat to Crimea? I actually don't know. But people who were party to the debate that led to Putin deciding they would annex Crimea say there was a real threat. I'm not an intelligence officer. Putin was an intelligence officer. He had no interest in Crimea until that moment. He was forced with making a decision. That's what leaders get paid for. for better or worse. Looking at it as best I can with the limited information we have, I don't see that Putin had a choice. But it wasn't a choice he wanted to make. It was forced on him. It wasn't consistent with what he thought his leadership of Russia was about, which was rebuilding Russia. Crimea was going to cost a fortune. It was going to rupture economic relations with the West. They knew all of this, but he felt he didn't have a choice. So if we impose this choice on him, this non-choice, we have to go back and ask what kind of policies we've been pursuing toward post-Soviet Russia since the end of the Soviet Union, which is one theme of my little book. And somebody said, Richard Sakwa, you know him, very good British writer, said, and I think the formulation is pretty good, Russia does not represent any threat to the United States except those we ourselves have generated. In other words, and he's not pro-Russian by any means. His position is that we pursued policy toward post-Soviet Russia that turned it into a threat. Now, that may be overstated somewhat, but I see it pretty much like that, too. And obviously, NATO expansion is where you begin the discussion, now right on Russia's borders.
Okay, I agree with some things that you said. I agree that NATO expansion was a mistake and that many things that the West did in the 1990s and the 2000s drove Russia away. We can go through the list. Bombing Serbia over Kosovo, Kosovo independence. I wouldn't say it's annexing it. It became an independent state. And Putin is certainly extremely upset about that to this day. Invasion of Iraq, support for Saakashvili in Georgia, and as you point out, putting this pressure on Ukraine to do a deal with the EU in 2013, which was myopic, and I think people didn't realize just how dangerous that was at the time. So I agree with that, but it doesn't answer the question. How do we get out of this? And I don't think we're going to agree on whether Putin had another choice, but it's beside the point at this moment.
What would the choice have been, given what he saw to be the threat to Crimea?
Well, first of all, I don't believe that he did see a threat to Crimea. I've talked to people who were quite close to the operation, and they did not say that they thought that NATO was about to take Ukraine in any sense. That there was not, perhaps very far in the future, there would be a question of Ukraine's accession to NATO, but definitely not in the near term. I think they were concerned about the base at Sevastopol. And so in that sense, yes, you could say that could provide a rationale for the operation. On the other hand, extremely costly, drives Ukraine away from Russia in a kind of irreparable way, creates this very difficult long-term division with the West, which is very hard to get over. So it seems to me he did have a choice, but he chose what he chose. And now, what do we do about it? How do we restart negotiations if he's not willing to, well, first of all, give up on eastern Ukraine, and secondly, reopen the question of Crimea, perhaps have an internationally monitored referendum or something like that.
I was going to say that would have been an important step, an internationally monitored referendum. But it required trust, which was in very short supply and is almost non-existent today. And the Minsk Accords, 1, 2, and 3, the same thing. Those provided a real alternative to the deepening civil war in Ukraine. I don't know if people know what the Minsk Accords were, but they involved France, Germany, Ukraine, Russia, in trying to bring more autonomy to Eastern Europe. There were language rights. It was a process that could have provided some way forward. But, you know, Daniel, it's even worse than you laid out, in the sense that we now have, as doctrine, the new defense strategy of the United States, which was articulated a few months ago, has now demoted the global war on terror, which should never have been a war in my opinion, to making Russia and China our primary enemies. So it's kind of engraved in policy, which makes it even more difficult to do what is imperative, which is how do we de-escalate? How do we find dialogue? How do we find a way forward that isn't about posturing? I would say one thing as someone in the media, Russia is a tormented, complex, interesting country. And there are many stories and many reporting articles to be done from it. What we get almost day in and day out is either, quote, the demonization of Putin or Russiagate. But it flattens the narrative of a country where you have to understand the ascendancy of the Russian Orthodox Church. You have to also know that in St. Petersburg a few days ago, hundreds of women protested war, that there is a civil society that still operates. So I'm just saying that Americans are getting a perception of Russia, even those who go on trips, of a hostility that is very hard to overcome, when in fact, if there were different kinds of perception combined with de-escalation, it would be one way forward, but there are no easy answers at this very critical, dangerous time.
Before we leave this, let me take up something Daniel raised, I don't know, as a suggestion or as a hypothesis, a new referendum. So I think that would be a terrific way of attempting to resolve. Like, let me back up. If Crimea is the worst problem in American-Russian relations, I don't think it is, but it might be, and that if we could resolve Crimea, we could go back to trying to build something more cooperative, if that's the case. Then Daniel suggested, I don't know if he advocated it, but he suggested, how about a new referendum? Let me remind you that in 2014, the inhabitants of Crimea voted in a referendum overwhelmingly to join Russia, to be annexed, become part of the Russian Federation. I think the referendum was pretty kosher, and Gallup has polled there at least once a year ever since and gotten about the same results, 84% in favor. But there's Gallup, and there's gunpoints, and there's emergency referendum, which are not a good idea. So what about a new one? And let's say it's done by the United Nations. And let's say that would remove the worst generator of conflict between East and West. We know what the outcome will be. I mean, there's no question. You're going to get the same vote. I don't think the West would accept it anyway, but it might. So we have asked people we know, the leadership of Crimea, and people around Putin, how about it? And just between us in this room, the answer we've gotten is that the leadership of Crimea is all for it, because they want the legitimacy it would bestow. And the Kremlin is not for it because it would be tacit to saying we made a mistake with the first one. Yeah. But if the Kremlin could be persuaded that the result of the referendum in Crimea, whether it's 64 or 84%, is for remaining with Russia, would end the question, they'd be foolish not to do it, even if they lose a little face. But I'm not so sure they can be persuaded, because their mood and their distrust at the moment toward us is so great. But you're right in suggesting it as something to push for, a kind of why not situation.
Okay, I agree. It would be a good step forward, and I also agree with you that the Kremlin will not agree. But nevertheless, it could be something that Western diplomacy
I think that there's,
pursues.
Domestically, coming back again to what's not being covered, one of the major issues in Russia today is pension reform, is a stagnating economy, not just due to sanctions, but to the general economic picture. And I think there's more grievance about funding Crimean operations and rebuilding, when in fact the rebuilding is so desperately needed in provincial towns and in cities and in parts of Russia. So I think we're going to see more difficulties in that arena in the coming months, and Putin's popularity has already plummeted, not plummeted, but has dropped 15–20%, which could explain part of why that State of the State speech he gave a week or so ago highlighted the new missiles and trying to distract or detract from the problems at home, which occupied 2/3 of his speech.
Right, and as you say, he did also talk about the economics, so he is concerned about that.
He's concerned.
Absolutely, his rating has fallen to 64% from up in the 80s. Things are changing in that regard.
But I would say that there is this opposition leader, some of you may have heard of, Alexei Navalny, who's an interesting figure. He's an internet muckraker. He's under house arrest too often, way too often. He did well in the run for mayor of Moscow. He started a public sector union, but he too would not diverge from Putin and the Kremlin on Crimea. I mean, he's a nationalist. So that when we talk about Putin, there are other forces in the political landscape of that country that need to be factored in. Steve says something that sounds very provocative, that Putin is not an aggressor, but is more of a reactive leader. I would argue he's a referee among competing factions in a country where you do have an elite that in some cases is even more nationalist on these issues than Putin.
Okay, I have to move on. There's so many interesting aspects to this, but I want to talk about Trump, because that's a big part of the book. So I want to make clear, first of all, that nothing in the book suggests that Steve is a big fan of our current president. You just think that he's been unfairly criticized for saying he wants to get along with Russia. And that the fuss over Russiagate, over collusion, alleged collusion, is what's making it impossible for Trump to do that, to improve relations. But let me play devil's advocate here. You could argue that Russiagate, the Russia scandal, isn't the real obstacle on the US side. That the real obstacle on our side is the people that Trump has appointed to his administration, who are increasingly hard line. So Mattis took a tough line on Ukraine while he was at Pentagon. Pompeo talks tough. John Bolton pushed hard to withdraw from the INF treaty. Trump likes generals and tough guys. Actually, that's quite a big contrast with Obama, who worked hard to keep arms control agreements in place and negotiated a new one, the New START. So is Russiagate really the problem, or is it actually Trump and the guys he appoints?
Well, I have no affection whatsoever or admiration for the people he's appointed. So, but, you know, he wanted them for whatever reason. My view on Trump is this. I obviously did not vote for Trump, did not donate to his campaign. I had almost no interest in Donald Trump until about the middle of the 2016 campaign. He said that he believed in cooperation with Russia. So people of my generation heard the word détente. You all know the word détente, right? Which was to try to lessen the dangers of the last Cold War by introducing elements of cooperation in place of conflict. So the more Trump talked about Russia, I heard a presidential candidate who was calling for a détente with Russia. I've been a détente guy since I was a very young man entering the field in the 1970s. I believed in détente with the Soviet Union, believe in détente with post-Soviet Russia. I think that American national security runs through Moscow still, not only because of the nuclear weapons, but primarily, and that détente is existential and essential. So I tend to support candidates, wherever they come from, who advocate détente. Then came this Russiagate thing. In the book, I argue that its origins are very suspicious. And I don't insist on this argument, but I give the evidence that I find exists, that the American intelligence services, particularly the CIA and the NSA, National Security Agency. Not the FBI, because I think Comey got dragged into it. He was so distracted with the Clinton scandal during the campaign, he really didn't know what was going on. But that the CIA and the NSA cooked up this Russiagate thing. And it involved things you've heard about, the Steele dossier, you've heard about that, which has stories about Trump selling out America to the Russians and urinating on Russian prostitutes in hotel rooms and all this stuff. And it's a bogus document. It's easy to, I doubt that any information in that document actually came from Russia. Though Steele, a former British intelligence officer, claimed this information came from Kremlin operatives. It's bunk, it's nonsense, it's fiction. But something was going on that was very unhealthy in my mind, and it was twofold. One, I felt our intelligence services were off the reservation. And two, that a candidate had come forward and advocated détente and was being targeted by the intelligence services. And that made me uneasy. Still, I didn't vote for Trump. But I've continued, since he's been president, when he does, I think, something sensible in regard to Russia, to applaud. I don't have any influence. But I do understand the position that I think Katrina comes closer to holding, that he is so loathsome in so many ways and untrustworthy that you can't even trust him with Russia. I don't rule that out, but I'm a little desperate. Now, we were down in Washington and talked to a few members of Congress who think as we do, and we're hoping they'll band together, and we'll hope some of them maybe will run for the presidency, and we hope they'll speak up. But at the moment, if you believe in détente, if you believe in it, all you got is Donald Trump, God help us.
This is where we really disagree, because, and I don't mean to get applause, but I also think it's a mistake, as I think I said earlier, or I may have said to the students, to be reflexively anti-Trump is to exclude possibilities that wiser people can pursue. I mean, to withdraw from Afghanistan after 17 years, you have young men and women fighting there who were born after 9/11, I think is a wise course. To halt endless wars, wars without victory, wars without end, is a wise course. To end regime change wars, to end policing the world. But I do think that what we've witnessed, a president is not just a president. A president comes with a team of people. That's why Franklin Roosevelt was so extraordinary. He had a brain trust, not to go that far back. But I was a fan of Obama's in certain respects, but I was not a fan of many of the people he had around him on foreign policy. I think liberal interventionism has been discredited, and I think the shock of Trump to our electoral system came from an anger with a discredited bipartisan foreign policy establishment and unwillingness on the part of millions in that establishment, or thousands, to look hard at the pathologies that are afflicting our country and that need to be addressed if we're going to get beyond not just Trump, but Trumpism. But I do see Daniel as being correct in noting that Trump came in without a team, except I might argue on trade. I think on trade he had Lighthouser and Navarro, but on foreign policy, he's run through all these people, and to end up with John Bolton, who is essentially the architect of the unraveling of our arms control infrastructure with the withdrawal from the ABM Treaty in 2002, is a failure. And it's not just Bolton. I won't expand to Venezuela, but Elliott Abrams, ay. So all I'm saying is that we need to think harder about electing not just an individual, but someone who has new ideas. I think 2020 will be a very interesting election year for a debate about a new foreign policy, whether you want to call it progressive or transpartisan. But I think we didn't get that debate in 2016. Bernie Sanders wasn't present in that way, and Hillary Clinton was tied, with all due respect, to, again, this kind of discredited bipartisan foreign policy establishment. I'll stop, but one of the reasons, if you haven't seen this survey, Trump did well in 60 counties in this country. It was done by 2 scholars. Counties where you had the highest level of kids who had been killed or wounded in these wars. And people heard in Trump, whether we want to hear it or not, someone saying, let's get out of the Middle East. Why have we wasted $5.6 trillion? Let's end these endless wars. He speaks out of both sides of his mouth, but he said something that touched a chord in a country where I would submit, and I say with humility in this room, there is a disconnect between a foreign policy establishment and ordinary Americans living their lives in parts of this country which have been deindustrialized and are in lousy shape.
Okay, on that note, let's open it up to the floor for questions. Okay, first of all, down here.
This concerns me.
Hang on a sec. We're getting the microphone for you.
I'm Bob. This concerns me very, very much, and I'd like to hear from both of you on cyber warfare.
Very, very briefly, I think we need rules of the road for cyber issues, cyber security. My understanding, maybe Daniel knows more about this, but there was a treaty on offer during the Obama years between Russia and the United States to regulate, to find those rules of the road. It was scuttled. But that is a new territory which is both very real, though sometimes hyped, because it's a way of sometimes avoiding, I think, harder issues. But it's real, and we do need to deal with it. And there should be almost an international convention, almost like a Geneva Convention on cyber. And there is some discussion about it, interestingly enough, in New York State from the Manhattan DA's office, because he deals with so much cybersecurity crime that they are interested in this issue.
I think it's even worse than that, because if you think about it, nuclear security is inseparable from cybersecurity. I mean, cyber attacks can attack the command and control systems that both systems have, well, both countries have, that control and regulate their nuclear weapons. I mean, I don't know enough about it to know whether intentional or accidental misuse of cyber weapons and attacks is the greatest danger. But I think if we want to have true nuclear security, we have to wrap into this and treat cyber warfare exactly the way over 50 years we've worried about and tried to control nuclear weapons. I was personally aghast when Obama's last statement, just before he left office in December, whenever he left office, I forget the year, said that as a result of Russiagate, for which there was no evidence, and he knew there was no evidence, that they had implanted through cyber technology an attack on Russia's infrastructure. And Biden, his loquacious vice president, went out and with great hilarity said, yes, and we could trigger this anytime we want. And I thought to myself, my God, what are they talking about? Did they implant it in their nuclear infrastructure, in their water supply, their electrical grids? What kind of a thing is this for an American president? I couldn't think of an analogy. So I think these two things are now linked. And that, for me, presidential leadership means giving this priority and leading with a proposal, meeting the Russians. The Russians offered to try a cyber, and we said no. Well, it was on offer, but we, let them discuss it, let them negotiate. I mean, if you talk about leadership, I mean, just to pander or not to the local audience, the only senior American, eminent political figure I know who understands this is your just retired governor, Jerry Brown.
Who's just become chair of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists.
He's got this stuff on his mind all the time. I don't see any other would-be president. I'd like to be able, I wish he would run, but I don't see any other presidential candidate connecting these dots. And it's another reason why I think, I was telling the kids today, I don't know, they range from 13, 14 to 18, I guess, who we met with earlier, that their generation now inherits this mess we've made. And there's new stuff there that we didn't have to face, cyber one of them.
What would Russia be like without Putin?
Well, it'll interest you to know that this is a raging debate today in Russia. You can hardly pick up a newspaper today, как будет Россия после Putin? How's Russia going to be after Putin? Because the assumption is, even if he tries to stay beyond his, what's he got, 5 years left? 24. He's got 5 years left. He just won his 6. Even if he stays, he's now 67. Is that right? He'd be in his, deep in his 70s. Of course, Russia has a tradition of leaders dying in office. And it's, well, you can laugh, but wait, why laugh? I mean, why laugh? I mean, that's a Russian tradition. The czars died in office, so Soviet leaders died in office. But I think he'll go. I don't think he'll stay indefinitely. So the question you ask is being asked in Russian in what we call intelligentsia and policy circles today. And it's conducted on several levels. One is who after Putin, but more interestingly, because nobody knows who, what after Putin? That's the more interesting question. I don't know, but I will say one thing, but this is a whole different discussion, and I think Daniel would probably disagree substantially with me. I think by every criterion except one, Putin has been an immensely successful Russian leader, considering the ruined country he inherited in 2000. And I think if there are historians to write this history, 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, Putin will be a towering figure in Russian history. Now, that doesn't mean there are not a lot of minuses associated with Putin's rule. But I think Russians themselves, and it's not Americans who should make these decisions, though Daniel and I get paid to do this, but in the end, it's Russians who have to decide this question. Putin is going to look very, very good to Russians. So what comes after, assuming nothing goes completely off the tracks and he leaves within 5 years, what comes after is going to be determined very much by what Putin has either achieved or not achieved in 5 years, and whom Putin decides to back. I mean, let's not be childish about it. He's going to want to protect his legacy and possibly himself. And there are all sorts of possibilities. I don't think it's going to be a liberal Democrat. They get 3, 4, 5% in all the polls.
And it will not be a woman.
Next question here.
What are some key similarities and differences between this Cold War and the old one?
I'm focused on the differences. The similarities, there's just a lot of similarities. It's the differences that worry me. The one that worries me the most today is that neither of the two leaders in power today is considered in the United States to be legitimate. So if you have a Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy and Khrushchev were able to avert nuclear war. So let's say you have a Cuban Missile Crisis in Syria or Ukraine, fully conceivable. Will the American political elites let Trump, who's said to be Putin's puppet, and Putin, who's said to be a demon, avert war? I worry about that all the time, all the time. The other thing that worries me is the new Cold War had its political epicenter in Berlin, far away from Russia. This one's unfolded right on Russia's borders, from the Baltics area all the way down to Ukraine. I mean, that just seems to me to be astonishingly dangerous. And of course, there's no precedent for the charge widely held that the American president is an agent of the Kremlin. I don't think we've ever had that in our history, or of a foreign power in modern times. So we got a new deck we're playing with, and we're going to hand it over to the young folks here. We're going to shuffle it up 3 or 4 times and give it to you. We're going to make a real mess of it and then let you deal with it. But I don't think there's time. I mean, Katrina looks for the solution from below. I think we're looking at months, maybe a year or 2. We need leadership from above, and we need it now, I think.
There was also, as Steve said earlier, I mean, you did have a countervailing force. You had people who considered themselves supporters of détente. And for example, when NATO expansion was a major issue roiling the political landscape. Wasn't it 1999, I think? You had major senators, major political figures opposing NATO expansion. George Kennan, the eminent diplomat, argued that if you proceeded with NATO expansion, it would trigger a new Cold War. Today, any discussion of maybe demilitarizing NATO or halting NATO expansion is either treated as delusional or pro-Trump, when in fact, or pro-Kremlin, when in fact it is, as Gorbachev tried in an alternative way in 1988 with the visionary idea of a common European home from Vladivostok to Lisbon, the NATO is a military organization. It's not a coffee klatch. And so the demilitarization of our mindset is also something very important that Gorbachev talks about, but it's lost, and I think that is both similarity and difference, but particularly a difference from the previous Cold War.
If I can just add a very quick note on one difference, as it seems to me, which has to do with public opinion, because Steve and Katrina mentioned the détente era, but if you go back to the 50s, and I looked this up today, 1954, what percentage of Americans had a favorable view of Russia or the Soviet Union? It's less than 2%.
54.
In 1954, yes. 1954, early Cold War, less than 2% had a favorable view, 90% had a negative view. If you looked if you look today, Gallup just had a poll out, 24% of Americans still say they have a favorable view of Russia. About 75% say a negative view. Okay, it's like huge disparity, but at least there's some people still who aren't buying the Kool-Aid.
I would say that on the eve of the midterms in 2018, Russiagate didn't even rank in the top 25 or 30 issues that were animating voters. And I did see a Gallup poll, forgive me, Daniel, where it said that 57% of Americans supported dialogue or cooperative relationship with Russia. So I think there's a lot to work with, and it speaks again, if I could, to the disconnect I often see between, quote, ordinary people and an establishment.
That poll she cited startled us. It was a Gallup poll. I mean, I don't know how reliable these polls are. Daniel may have a better sense. But they asked people, Gallup did, would you prefer a more cooperative relationship with Russia? This was about 8-9 months ago, I think. Or would you prefer a tougher approach exemplified by more sanctions against Russia? And 57% of Americans preferred a more cooperative relationship. In this environment, in the Russiagate environment, with all the allegations, that was, to me, that astonished me, that number. 57%, that's a chunk, preferred a better, more cooperative relationship. So where's the political leader who's going to come forward and appeal to that 57% of them? Because they always read the polls.
I'm trying not to divert from the subject in Crimea and Ukraine, but can we direct our attention to Asia and to what's going on in the waters with the new ice fields that Russia is trying to build, and that Putin presumptively might lead or divert the direction from what's going on in his country and with us in order to nation build and really, really earn his reputation as a leader?
Well, I don't know if Daniel's followed this. I'm guessing he has. There's a big discussion, and this is not directly in response to your question, but generally, big discussion in Moscow about the pivot to the east. This is the language they use, the pivot to the east. So, historically, Russia's always been between east and west. We know during the Iron Curtain, they turned their back on the west. When the Iron Curtain came down, they rushed into the west, and they got to get kicked back. And Moscow elite opinion is sort of divided between those who want to go completely to the west, those who want to go east, and those who want to be Eurasian, a little bit of both. I mean, you got this thing. But what's striking in Russia is, of course, the turn to the east. And the justification is twofold, that China is Russia's best strategic partner in every regard, economic, militarily, in terms of energy, infrastructure, reliability, diplomacy. There is that point of view. And the other point of view, which is important, is they have no choice. They've been rejected by the West. I mean, in Moscow, the view is, rightly or wrongly, I mean, we can argue with it, but we got to understand it, that ever since Gorbachev, this is where they begin the story, Russia tried to join the West. Tried under Gorbachev, tried under Yeltsin, tried during the first 6, 7 years of Putin to join the West, and they were rejected, rejected, rejected. So the reaction is, chvatit, it's enough. We're going where we can and where we're wanted. Now, that's bad in my mind. Bad for Russia, bad for Russia's future politically, bad culturally, bad for the West. But I do believe we, in fact, did reject Russia. And the reaction was entirely predictable. Is it reversible? Probably. But it would take a concerted effort on the part of Western leaders to reel Russia back toward the West. I mean, they've got their Western ties. They'll sell their gas and energy to Germany and to those countries. But they have turned to the East for their future and their security. And I can't say that if I was, advising a Russian leader, I could make the case for sticking with the West after the last 15 to 20 years.
Can you comment on how America and Russia will conflict with Estonia or over Estonia?
You ever thought about that, Daniel? Estonia?
Well, what I know about it, which is not that much, is that Estonia is very concerned about what they perceive as pressure coming from Russia on many different levels, including cyber warfare, and that they've reacted, as Estonians do, in a very concentrated and determined way to try and build up their defenses. But this gets back to the issue of NATO. Whether or not it was a good idea to expand NATO, and I'm really with Steve on the side of doubts about that. Now Estonia is a NATO member, and it becomes a responsibility, or it is a responsibility of NATO to figure out what is necessary to deter subversion by Russia in Estonia, even if it takes very subtle forms, like cyber warfare or stirring up nationalist movements within Estonia. And that's a challenge that all these countries are facing. Now, we could say, well, we don't have very comprehensive, concrete evidence of what's going on there, but in those borderline states, people have a lot of experience, and they definitely believe that Russia is interested in destabilizing their societies and politics.
Do you think Russia is interested in destabilizing their society and politics?
I think that Putin is interested in control and influence, and that the techniques that are used increasingly do aim to destabilize. I think he's not trying to destroy the EU, he's more waiting for it to degenerate, to decay, but it's not in his interest to see a very cohesive, confident European Union competing with him.
I don't see the logic in this, though, because we surely agree that Putin's mission, whether chosen or not, was to rebuild Russia economically and modernize it. And to do that, he wanted what he called modernizing partnerships with the West. Why would he want to destabilize the European Union when it's Russia's single largest trading partner? I can't connect these dots. I see Putin as somebody who desperately wants stability, not instability. I don't follow the logic of it.
Well, yeah, you can trade with countries that are politically not so stable, but the main point I would make is that until 2014, I agreed more than today with Steve, and I used to ask exactly that question. What is the logic? What is in it for Putin? And I could explain the vast majority of foreign policy actions of Russia with that kind of approach. Since 2014 in Crimea, I see repeated decisions where the cost-benefit calculus just doesn't seem to make sense. So either I really don't understand the costs and benefits as Putin sees them, or he has a different way of making decisions. So I've mostly given up on thinking that I can rationally backwards engineer Putin's decisions, and I'm trying to respond just based on what we know.
All right.
I'm reading. Who do we have? Or you want me to go? I'm reading Michael Lewis's The Fifth Risk because I'm a career public administrator. And in the first pages, he talks about the Department of Energy and no one from the Trump administration showing up nor understanding what they do. So my question to you is the hollowing out of our governmental infrastructure, which is certainly near and dear to my heart, I think provides additional risk to the equation and what we're talking about. So perhaps could you comment on that, the hollowing of our overwatch?
When we think about Trump's corruption, the real corruption is putting in charge of these government agencies the very people who want to hollow them out, who want to dismantle, who have no respect for government and government's role in the service of the common good. We heard the other night that immediately, I believe it was after Crimea, the Commerce Department just knocked out a whole set of exchanges. This relates to, government is also about exchanges with other countries. Knocked out a whole set of exchanges, so you don't have those layers anymore. But Trump and Trumpism has, and to be honest, the Republican mantra has been to starve government in the bathtub. I mean, let's remember Grover Norquist, right? I mean, so there is a contempt for government and government's role, and Michael Lewis's book is a very important contribution to reminding us of those often nameless, faceless government, excuse the word, bureaucrats who play an important role in our country. I thought the government shutdown, which I think Trump failed miserably at, did show a face of government. The woman who runs the air controllers union spoke articulately about government's functions. So what is there to say? I mean, I think it's not just Trump, but it's Republicans who over the decades have tried to dismantle, downgrade the important legitimate role government has in our society.
I'd like to ask a question. I'd like to ask a question about the future of Russia, which you went towards a little bit when you were talking about Putin's desire to rebuild the country. If you go to Russia, a couple of things strike you. First of all, it's a relatively depopulated country. And it's been depopulated by wars and other disasters that have killed tens of millions of people at a time. The second, and so I'd like to ask you, we see that the Russian population is declining. Where is that going to take Russia in the long term? And a second one is, if you go to some place, not so much here in LA, but if you go to Miami or similar places, you see a lot of Russians around, and you see real manifestations of corruption in Russia. So two aspects: the decline in population and the effects of corruption. Where do you see Russia headed in the long term?
I'm a little unnerved by the reference to Miami because I used to live there. And I know a lot of Russians who live there, and they've all bought condos down there carrying cash because they don't need mortgages. And that's what Don Jr. or the other kid meant when he said we find there's a lot of Russian money in our portfolio. All the places where my elderly aunts now passed once lived are now Trump this or that. He's just bought them up and rebranded them. And you're right, it's a fantastically large Russian community with movies and restaurants and Russian speakers down in South Miami now, for better or worse. Well, they're worried about the demography of Russia. There's no question about it. They went through a lot of traumas, some of them many decades ago, some of them recent. We all know that the Soviet Union lost about 27 million people in World War II. That's not something you recover from quickly, and yet, even the horrible Stalinist regime carried out the fastest post-war, by nasty means, recovery after World War II. So the real disaster hit in the 1990s, the modern disaster, when Russia went into what I think is correctly described as the worst economic depression ever in peacetime. And you ended up with men dying at 57, a negative birth rate, epidemics of diseases that had long been eradicated. It was a catastrophe. And that's why Katrina and I were startled but not surprised that when we first heard of this man, Vladimir Putin, and we asked a friend of ours who was, please don't tell Mr. Mueller, a KGB officer from Leningrad, so he knew Putin, because I find it's important to talk to Russian intelligence officers because they know stuff, as like Obama liked to say, he knows stuff. Well, I want to learn stuff, so please talk to me. This guy turns to us and said, on Vladimir Spasito, he's Vladimir the Savior. And I thought, what, you know, whenever a Russian tells me something I understand, I pretend I don't because I want him to explain it to me. And so he did, and this is, we're talking 2000, maybe 1999, when Putin was only prime minister, that Putin has been sent to save Russia. One of the problems Putin had was this horrible demographic trend in Russia. They turned it around a bit. For, I think, the last 2 or 3 years, they had a positive birth rate. That is, more births than deaths. But last year, I think not, right? Or this year. It's reversed again. He's done everything imaginable under the sun using old Soviet methods. That is, you get 3 kids, you get a new apartment. I mean, they are giving cash for kids, literally. Well, you can laugh. Other countries have done this. But we have some friends who are probably in their 30s with 2 or 3 kids whose main problem is being able to afford a nice apartment where there's some green and they don't have to ride the train 3 hours a day to work. And from the government, for having the 3 kids, they've gotten a new apartment and other stuff. So it's an all-out mobilization, Soviet style, I guess you'd say, all-out mobilization to get women to have children and families to have more than one, because Russians leaned for a long time toward one child. But for that, you've got to provide a decent wage, housing, health care, all the rest. But then there's another question. Russia's the largest territorial country in the world, but you don't have to occupy the entire country. So you'd have to ask, what is the optimum Russian population? So they're now at about, what, 145 million? I mean, how many does Russia need to be healthy? 200 million? I mean, I don't know. I mean, they were used to the Soviet Union, but there were so many non-Slavs that toward the end, non-Slavs were becoming the majority of the population because of the much higher birth rate in Central Asia than in the Slavic nations. So, you know, this is a kind of moral, ethical, nationalist decision that Russians have to sort out. But any talk of Russia dying or becoming a secondary nation, there's nothing in history to suggest that perspective. And there's no reason why we shouldn't wish them well. We don't want a feeble Russia. We don't want a Russia at risk of losing control of its weapons or of anything. And remember, I mean, if you want to, Russia's still, I think, the largest, has more fresh water than any other country in the world, and we're told that's the next scarce resource. So Russia has a disproportionate share of world resources. We need Russia.